unbreakable and legendary. The Red Army was a heroic force for several generations of Soviet people. For decades, it remained one of the largest and most technically equipped armies in the world. The Soviet people were proud of their army, and it was a justified pride. The great victory of the Red Army over the fascist Wehrmacht decided the outcome of World War II. But our army knew not only the taste of glory and victory, but also the bitterness of defeats and enormous, often senseless losses. This is less known, less remembered. What was the army like before the war? What was it like? That historically brief period was full of dramatic events. It encompassed the birth, maturation, and actual destruction of the workers' and peasants' Red Army. Russia, the Forgotten Years, the History of the Red Army, Part 1. The decree to create the Red Army was signed by Lenin in January 1918, shortly after the formation of the political police, the Cheka. At that time, the Bolshevik armed forces consisted of Red Guard detachments. These were mostly workers, untrained in military affairs, and soldiers and sailors who had joined the revolution. But it turned out that such forces could not defeat all the Bolsheviks' opponents. Lenin put forward a slogan: "Revolutions are only worth something when they know how to defend themselves." Defending the revolution was the task of the new army. Initially, it was elite in its own way, a workers' and peasants' army. One could join only with two class recommendations. It was formed on a voluntary basis according to Marxist principles. There was a lack of military discipline, orders were discussed, and commanders were elected. Lenin did not yet see the need for regular troops. The disbanded Tsarist army was to be replaced by an armed people, a people's militia. These views were fully shared by the first military commissars. Former quartermaster Nikolai Krylenko, former non-commissioned officer Pavel Dybenko, Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko, who once graduated from the Junker School, and Nikolai Podvoisky, a professional revolutionary, in whose hands all military power was initially concentrated. The combat capability of the Red Army was soon put to its first test. While Lenin and Trotsky were staging an unsuccessful play of peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk, German troops occupied Ukraine and Crimea, invaded the Caucasus, and began an offensive in the Baltics and towards Petrograd. In response to the Sovnarkom's appeal, "The socialist fatherland is in danger," the people of Petrograd moved to assembly points. Weapons were distributed, and trains were sent to the suburbs and capitals. However, an armed clash did not occur. The Germans did not escalate. On February 23rd, the day when the birth of the Red Army is officially celebrated, Germany effectively stopped advancing towards Petrograd and agreed to a peace treaty. It seemed that this episode of history confirmed the correctness of Lenin's words. If every citizen of the state is armed, then no enemy can be feared by Russia. But other events completely refuted this thesis. On the same day, February 23rd, parts of the Tsarist army, disbanded by the Bolsheviks, left the city of Pskov without a fight. On March 3rd, the day the Brest Peace was signed, a sailor detachment led by its commander, Pavel Dybenko, fled the battlefield, surrendering to the Germans. The Bolsheviks did not yet have a real army. Lev Trotsky, the first of the Bolshevik leaders of the highest rank, understood the need to create a regular army. He presented his point of view to the Sovnarkom, headed by Lenin. At Trotsky's suggestion, a Supreme Military Council was created, headed by 𝑀𝒉𝒆 𝒊𝒂𝒓𝒔, a Tsarist General and Chief of Staff, People's Commissar for Military Affairs. Nikolai Podvoisky, a fanatical Marxist, resigned in protest. Lenin appointed Trotsky to his post. Taking office on March 13, 1918, he energetically set to work. In the life of 39-year-old Lev Trotsky, a period began that can be boldly called stellar. A man who barely knew how to use personal weapons became the creator of the regular cadre Red Army. When Trotsky began this activity, the Bolsheviks had 300,000 volunteers, poorly trained and poorly armed. From July 1918, universal military service for workers aged 18 to 40 was introduced, and universal military training. The election of commanders was abolished. Red Army soldiers took an oath. Branches of the military began. To form: infantry, artillery, cavalry, armored forces consisting of several armored trains and 200 armored cars. In the city of Kovrov, the first Soviet design bureau for automatic weapons appeared. It was headed by the talented designer Vladimir Fedorov, who had created an excellent automatic rifle before the revolution. Future celebrities Vasily Degtyaryov, Fyodor Tokarev, and others started in this design bureau. By the end of the 1920s, their ideas would begin to outpace global design thought. The first artillery design bureau, headed by Franz Lender, also worked productively. Trotsky succeeded in many things because he clearly understood that any business, including military, should be handled by specialists. With Lenin's full support, Trotsky organized the recruitment of former Tsarist officers and generals into the Red Army. They were appointed to command positions. Almost half of the pre-revolutionary officer corps served in the Red Army. It was largely thanks to them that it owed its victories in the Civil War. One such officer was 𝑚𝒉𝒆, a former colonel of the General Staff, a Latvian peasant by origin. He commanded the Latvian Division, which played a decisive role in suppressing anti-Bolshevik uprisings in Moscow and Yaroslavl. He was then appointed commander of the Eastern Front forces. It was from the east that the greatest threats to Soviet power came in the spring of 1918. The Czechoslovak Corps rebellion flared up on the Volga, and White Guard detachments quickly formed. The Eastern Front became the most important theater of military operations. With the arrival of 𝒉𝒆, the organization of the first 5 regular RKK armies began here. These formations managed to stop the enemy's advance. By early October 1918, the Red Army was winning along the entire Volga line, capturing strategically important centers Khasan, Simbirsk, Samara. The situation was much worse for the Red Army in 1918 in the south. Incompetent interference in military affairs by Joseph Stalin and partisan methods of troop management led to the fact that Denikin's volunteer army managed to seriously strengthen itself in the North Caucasus. At this moment, in the fall of 1918, Trotsky carried out a new reconstruction of the military department. Instead of the Supreme Military Council, the Revolutionary Military Council of the Republic was created. The position of Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces was established. It was first held by 𝒊𝒂, and then by Sergei Kamenev, also a colonel of the Old Army. The Revolutionary Military Council was headed by People's Commissar for Military Affairs Trotsky, who remained in these positions until January 1925, the end of his political life in the USSR. Democratic orders were being built in the Red Army of that time. There were no military ranks and ordinary soldiers. There were fighters and commanders with equal civil rights. Military ranks were absent, but this did not mean that orders from commanders could be discussed, and failure to comply with them threatened severe consequences. In August 1918, by Trotsky's order, soldiers who deserted from Khasan were put on trial. The sentence was execution. Throughout 1918, Red Army units were replenished with new detachments of trained fighters. Several military schools were opened, including those with accelerated programs. The General Staff Academy was restored, military regulations were approved, and a unified Red Army uniform was introduced. In September, the first and for several years the only Soviet Order of the Red Banner was established. Order numbered. 1 was awarded to Vasily Blucher for a brilliant raid behind the White Lines. No. 2 was awarded to Iona Yakir for victory near Voronezh over General Krasnov's units. In total, about 15,000 people received the Order of the Red Banner during the Civil War. A combat award was also an honorary weapon, a revolver, or a saber with a gilded hilt. Despite all of Trotsky's efforts to strengthen the army, the situation of the Soviet Republic sharply worsened by the end of the year. Admiral Alexander Kolchak, proclaiming himself the supreme ruler of Russia and supreme commander-in-chief, reorganized the retreating white troops and formed 2 armies. Kolchak's forces mobilized a significant number of peasants dissatisfied with Bolshevik policies requisitioning grain. By New Year, Kolchak's troops occupied Perm. On the southern front at the end of 1918, the Don. Cossack army of Krasnov was operating successfully. In the north and the Far East, the Entente landed numerous troops. However, at the beginning of the next year, the Bolsheviks managed to improve the situation. By this time, they had already deployed 12 armies with a total strength of over 1.5 million people. Trotsky went to the southern front and organized a counterattack that stopped Krasnov's forces. The eastern front stabilized. Kolchak's position was complicated by the fact that peasant sympathies were not long on his side. In the West, after Germany's capitulation, the liberation of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics was rapidly underway. By the spring of 1919, 2 viewpoints on the principles of forming the Red Army were clearly defined. Trotsky and his constant deputy 𝒂𝒊𝒔𝒂𝒓, supported by Lenin, continued to advocate for strengthening the regular army, which should be based on professionals, generals and officers endowed with full military authority. Stalin, Voroshilov, Dzerzhinsky, and other party officials believed the army should answer to them, and commanders should be chosen from the working class, guided by class instincts. At the 8th Congress of the Communist Party in March 1919, this movement, called the military opposition, was criticized and defeated. This was one of the decisive victories of the Red Army. Discipline continued to strengthen, and centralized management was introduced. But there were other problems. Although the main arsenals were in the hands of the Soviets and the Red Army did not face a serious shortage of small arms, it began to lag behind the West in weaponry and military technology directly linked to the industrial crisis in Russia. The main infantry weapon at this time, and for many years to come, remained the so-called three-line rifle, the Tula rifle with a 7.62 mm caliber. Sergei Mosin created it. 1891. The Reds had no tanks or aircraft of their own. Even at the end of the Civil War, the Red Army had only 984 captured tanks. Moreover, due to a lack of fuel and ammunition, the equipment was not used to its full potential. The first Soviet tank, modeled after the French Renault, was assembled at the Krasnaya Sormova plant only in 1920. This tank, named Fighter for Freedom Comrade Lenin, reached a speed of 8.5 km, weighed 7 tons, had a 37mm gun, and armor up to 16mm. The number of Soviet artillery pieces was rapidly increasing. Guns, with calibers from 76 to 152 millimeters, were often mounted on armored trains, which were called fortresses on wheels during the Civil War. In many battles, their role was decisive. In the summer of 1919, Denikin's advance on Moscow brought the Soviet Republic to the brink of collapse. Such a situation could hardly have arisen if not for the political games at the top of the Soviet leadership. As a result of complex intrigues, Lenin replaced the commander-in-chief Vatsetis with his man Sergei Kamenev. Vatsetis would never again be commander-in-chief. However, his plan to defeat Denikin had to be used when Denikin's forces reached Orel. In close proximity to the capital, large Red forces were hastily transferred from the east to the south, organizing a counteroffensive. Denikin was forced to retreat. To complete Denikin's defeat, it was decided to form a large mobile unit. On November 17, 1919, Trotsky signed an order to create the first cavalry army. Its role in the Civil War would be greatly exaggerated. Due to the indiscipline of its command, the army repeatedly disrupted important frontline operations. It also distinguished itself with a series of pogroms, for which several hundred cavalrymen were executed in 1920. But neither Commander Budyonny nor Commissar Voroshilov were ever punished. Of course, there were some early cavalry victories, but only one should be considered truly serious: the breakthrough of the Polish front in 1920. Before the war with Poland in the spring of 1920, the regular Red Army numbered 5 million people, including over 1 million combat personnel with battle experience and a taste for victory. The Polish army was 10 times smaller. Pilsudski did not receive the military aid from allies he had hoped for. However, Tukhachevsky's plan for a blitzkrieg against Poland could not be realized. The Red Army's advanced units, fighting their way into Poland, were left without support, encircled, and the entire Polish campaign ended in failure. However, Frunze's troops, in late autumn of the same year, at the cost of enormous sacrifices, drove the Whites out of Crimea. The Civil War was drawing to a close. The end was marked by the suppression of anti-Bolshevik uprisings in Kronstadt and Tambov, by Red Army units under Tukhachevsky caused by the exploitative grain requisitioning. The year was 1921. Although the situation on the empire's outskirts had not fully stabilized, nevertheless the army could be reduced. The blood-drained country could not sustain a 5 million strong machine. As a result of the reform, the Red Army's size decreased tenfold over 3 years. It was divided into two parts, the regular and the territorial militia. The first part consisted of 260,000 military personnel who were on active duty. The militia part was about the same size, but only senior commanders were on active duty. The rest, so-called reservists, were called up for military training for 1 to 2 months a year. This was the smallest and least combat-ready army in the history of the Russian Empire. Trotsky began the reform, others finished it. After Lenin's death, Trotsky, lacking support in the party leadership, was removed from the army and major politics, and then from the country. In January 1925, 40-year-old Mikhail Frunze became the head of the RKK. Frunze did not belong to any political factions, serving only the cause. Stalin failed to establish a trusting relationship with him, and the chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council, Frunze, died on the operating table in October of the same year. Stalin nominated his loyal servant Voroshilov for the vacant post. This man, who hated any display of intellect, first tried to organize the expulsion of military specialists from the Red Army. However, at that moment, Stalin did not support him. The 1920s were a time of rapid development of Soviet military science. In military theory, two groups competed. Tukhachevsky and his supporters advocated for a rapid offensive strategy in future wars. A small group of theorists led by Alexander Svechin proposed the opposite idea: strategic defense or a war of attrition. In 1923, Svechin's book Strategy was published. This outstanding work, which marked an era in military science, would be banned in the 1930s, and its author would be executed in 1938. However, in the 1920s, a unified strategic concept had not yet formed. The sides agreed that the upcoming war would be a war of machines and new, more powerful weapons, including chemical. One element of preparation for a possible war was the formation in 1927 of the Youth Society for Assisting the Armed Forces, 𝒖𝒔𝒂𝒓𝒔. Within a year, 2 million young men and women joined, learning to shoot, mastering the basics of military professions, and studying military technology in hundreds of clubs and circles. In short, they seriously and enthusiastically played at war. Meanwhile, the Red Army, like the entire country, faced serious technical difficulties. There was no standard small arms, and their own aircraft and tanks were still not being produced, and foreign ones were insufficient. There was also a lack of artillery, and almost no new military equipment models were being created. At the end of 1927, in a government report, Tukhachevsky described the state of the army as non-combat ready. The result was his removal from the position of Chief of Staff of the RKK. In 1929, the Red Army participated in an armed conflict for the first time since the Civil War. In Manchuria, the Chinese attempted to take control of the Chinese Eastern Railway, which was built and operated by the Russians. To defend the strategically important railway, a special Far Eastern Army was created in August 1929, led by Vasily Blyukher. In the fall of the same year, this army conducted several successful military operations, resulting in the Chinese forces being defeated and capitulating. Blyukher was again awarded Order No. 1, this time the newly established Order of the Red Star. Soviet Russia continued to own the CER until the mid-1930s, when, after occupying Manchuria, the Japanese, on behalf of the puppet state of Manchukuo, demanded that the USSR relinquish the railway. This time, the Soviet government conceded without a fight, and in 1935 withdrew its troops, selling its share in the CER to Japan for a symbolic sum. The resurgence of militarism in the West forced Stalin to bring Tukhachevsky back to Moscow. In 1931, he was appointed one of Voroshilov's deputies and head of armaments for the Red Army. The next 6 years in the history of the RKK can be called the era of Tukhachevsky. This man, who had previously made many mistakes, managed in a short time to create the best army in Europe. Despite ongoing economic difficulties, the military industry began to function. The first aircraft factories appeared. New tank workshops were reconstructed and built at tractor factories. Armored and mechanized troops were formed. The tanks created in the USSR were not inferior in tactical and technical characteristics to the best foreign models. In 1931, the light tank T-26 was released. Initially, it had 2 turrets. Then a single turret version was built with a 45mm gun and a DT machine gun paired with it. This tank, weighing about 10 tons, had armor ranging from 6 to 15mm. Speed was around 30 km per hour, and a range of 133 people. In 1934, the tank got a stronger weapon, a short-barreled 76mm gun. Flamethrower tanks, bridge layers, and mine clearers were based on this tank. The T-26 was the first to use a conical turret shape and sloped armor plate. Modifications of this tank served in the Red Army for 10 years. Alongside the T-26, the fast BT tank was produced. On a combined wheel-track drive, the most common version was the BT-7. It reached speeds of up to 73 km on wheels and up to 53 km on tracks. The medium tank T-28 was much more powerful, with a 76mm gun and 4 machine guns. A crew of 6 was well protected by armor up to 80mm thick. The amphibious tank T-38 was also mass-produced, used for reconnaissance and infantry support during river crossings. In 6 years, the Army's tanks doubled, and combat planes increased 7-fold. In 1936, Vasily Graben's design bureau created and soon produced the world's best 76mm field gun, the F-22. After its upgrade, it served throughout the 1941-45 war. The army's structure is changing. It's now formed on a professional basis, making service the soldier's sole job. Personnel numbers rise to 1.5 million. In fall 1935, personal military ranks were introduced. The top rank, Marshal of the Soviet Union, was given to Vasily Blucher, Semyon Budyonny, Alexander Yegorov, Kliment Voroshilov, and Mikhail Tukhachevsky. 6 military academies opened during these years. 90% of commanders, from the regimental level up, got higher military education. It was quality education. Commanders studied deep battle theory and operations by Georgy and Sersin, the leading theory for breaking through deep enemy defenses then. It was applied in exercises of the Kiev and Belarusian military districts. As Tukhachevsky shifted his stance on strategic defense, a 50-80 kilometer deep defensive system was set up along the USSR's western borders, able to drain any attacking army. In the mid-1930s, the Red Army, applying deep battle theory, formed the first mechanized corps, combining tanks and motorized infantry. They had up to 500 T-26 and BT tanks. Airborne troops were created for the first time globally. Strategic defense and offensive techniques were practiced at the Kiev maneuvers of 1935. They were led by the commander of the Kiev military district, Iona Yakir. The main task of the maneuvers was to organize the interaction of different branches of the military: infantry, cavalry, artillery, tank, and airborne units. The actions of the paratroopers were particularly impressive. The landing of thousands of troops with combat equipment was a novelty in military art at that time. The following year, maneuvers were conducted in Belarus. More than 1,300 tanks, 630 aircraft, and numerous other equipment participated. The maneuvers were led by 𝑹𝒖𝒔𝒔𝒊𝒂. Again, significant attention was given to airborne operations. Though these exercises had a lot of showmanship, they showed the high combat readiness of the Soviet armed forces and impressed the invited representatives of the general. Staffs of Czechoslovakia, France, Italy, Germany, and other countries. Among the guests were generals of Hitler's army, Guderian and Manstein, who would later apply the deep battle theory against the Red Army. But by early 1937, the Red Army was stronger than ever and ready to repel any potential aggressor. It retained the spirit of the Revolutionary Army from the Civil War period. It was truly a people's army. Conscription into the Red Army was perceived as a celebration. The army turned young guys into real citizens. Plus, it provided them with skills. There was no class or national division in the troops. Most commanders were cultured individuals. There was no question of degrading human dignity. 1937 marked the start of this army's end. Stalin wanted Voroshilov's and Budyonny's army, not Tukhachevsky's. By then, art was boxed into socialist realism. The country's scientific intellect was crushed. The smartest peasants were destroyed, and the rest were herded into collective farms. Then it was the Red Army's turn. The secret police's compromising material on top army leaders was put into action. Tukhachevsky and 7 other top military leaders were accused of conspiracy and treason and executed on June 11, 1937. Before the execution, Tukhachevsky said, "You are not shooting us, but the Red Army." He was right. The next year, over 40,000 Red Army and Navy commanders were eliminated by state security on Stalin's orders. And by the end of 1939, 125,000 so-called enemies of the people were repressed in the army. The main losses were among the senior and high command. All commanders of troops, naval forces, corps, divisions, fleets, and flotillas perished. The entire general staff apparatus, almost all commissars from the regimental level and above. The entire strategic intelligence apparatus, heads and instructors of academies, and many others. In the 1.5 million strong Red Army, there were almost no people left who knew how to fight. The army kept its name, but it was a completely different army. An atmosphere of suspicion, informants, and lack of initiative prevailed. In the next 3 years, the USSR's armed forces fell further behind the armies of tech-advanced countries. Purges of defense plant leaders and top designers slowed new weapon production. Grigory Kulik, the head of armaments, called the automatic weapon a bourgeois invention, more fit for police than the army. It wasn't produced, but great attention was paid to perfecting bayonet fighting techniques. Artillery, according to Stalin's strategists, was supposed to be horse-drawn, not mechanized. The adoption of rocket artillery was delayed. Ironically, the decision to mass-produce the famous Katyushas was made only on June 21, 1941, just hours before the entry of the USSR into the war with Germany. New models of planes and tanks struggled to reach the factory floors. Only the cavalry experienced an extraordinary rise. By early 1942, plans were made to deploy 99 cavalry divisions. 5 times more funds were allocated for this than for the Navy. Stalin's strategy assumed that if the USSR was attacked, a massive cavalry raid would quickly move the fighting to enemy territory, after which the proletariat would rise up, starting a civil war against the bourgeoisie. fundamentally new state of the Red Army made itself known as early as 1938, during the armed clash at the Soviet-Chinese border near Lake Khasan. Despite having superior forces, the Soviet troops started off poorly against the Japanese, who had occupied Manchuria. On July 31st, the Japanese managed to seize the heights dominating the area. A week later, concentrating forces 10 times the size of the enemy, the Soviet troops launched a new offensive. Artillery and aviation acted clumsily and failed to suppress the Japanese firing points. When the attack began, they came to life and formed a continuous line of fire. The Soviet troops, although they recaptured the hills, suffered huge losses. It was a victory equivalent to a complete military failure. Vasily Blucher, the commander of the Far Eastern Front, likely wouldn't have allowed this if his troops had experienced commanders. However, most of them were repressed, not without Blucher's own knowledge. A year later, on the Mongolian-Manchurian border near the Khalkhin Gol River, Soviet troops, as allies of Mongolia, once again clashed with the Japanese. Although neither side intended to engage in serious combat this time, the border conflict escalated into a 4-month war. Initially, the Japanese advanced successfully, pushing the Red Army from the right bank of the Khalkhin Gol. They couldn't be driven back until Georgy Zhukov was appointed commander of the Soviet First Army Group. Georgy Zhukov concentrated 3 times more armored vehicles than the enemy had, and almost twice as many aircraft. In 2 battles, he encircled and crushed a large group of the 6th Japanese Army. On September 16th, the war ended. Losses were about equal, around 20,000 on each side. However, Japan lost its desire to fight the Red Army for a long time. Meanwhile, the victory at Khalkhin Gol boosted Stalin's military and political ambitions. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was signed. A secret protocol set the spheres of influence for the USSR and Germany in Eastern Europe. In September, the Red Army launched a 12-day campaign into western Ukraine and western Belarus. Militarily, it was poorly organized. The tank corps moved very slowly. But since there was no enemy there, the campaign ended well. The USSR gained 190,000 square kilometers of land with 12 million people. The western border shifted 250-350 kilometers. Joint military parades of Red Army and Nazi Wehrmacht units were held in the occupied territories. Stalin ordered the dismantling of the strong border defenses built years earlier, as they were now deep inside Soviet territory. On November 30, 1939, the USSR's war with Finland began. The reason was Finland's refusal to move its border away from Leningrad and the Murmansk Railway. The main attack targeted the fortified line between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland, called the Mannerheim Line. Soviet troops faced total failure. There was a complete lack of knowledge about the enemy's capabilities and the theater of operations. The Finns' widespread use of automatic weapons, which the Soviets lacked, was unexpected. The attack on Finland caused global outrage. The USSR was expelled from the League of Nations. In Finland, the people rose for a national war. However, the Soviet Union didn't stop fighting. On February 11, 1940, with massive forces, it launched a new offensive. It moved very slowly. Commanders and high command struggled to lead troops in modern warfare. Soviet troops suffered huge losses in killed, wounded, and frostbitten. Yet, on March 11th, the Mannerheim Line was breached, and 2 days later, fighting stopped. The border was changed, and Stalin was satisfied with this. The people celebrated the victors. No one knew Soviet casualties exceeded the entire Finnish army. 70,000 dead and missing. Another 5,500 soldiers who returned from Finnish captivity ended up in Soviet camps. Militarily, it was a disaster. Many historians think this inspired Hitler to attack the USSR. Scriptwriters Yuri Geller, Alexander Eisenberg, Judy Balbrus. Consultants Nikolai Mitrofanov, Yulia Safonenko, Elena Kolikova. Producers John Dukas, Matthew King Kaufman, Maxim Zolotukhin. Directors Alexander Eisenberg, Matthew King Kaufman. The film uses materials from the Russian State Archive of Film and Photo Documents, the Television and Radio Fund, the Central Museum of the Armed Forces, and the State Film Fund. Produced by Eastern Light Krupny Plan Castle Communications. The film is voiced by NTV.